They say a soldier can never truly leave the war behind. Sometimes, the battlefield simply changes its coordinates. I bought a forgotten house on a frozen Michigan lake to bury my past, only to find a deadly corporate conspiracy buried right beneath my own floorboards. Now, trapped in a blinding blizzard with a ruthless kill squad closing in, I must awaken the lethal instincts I swore to forget. Because the real battle is just beginning. Subscribe to Veteran Challenges and join me as the storm unfolds. The air in Galeport tasted of rusted iron and old lake water. In the autumn of 2023, I, Declan Cross, arrived at the edge of this fading Michigan industrial town, carrying a duffel bag of civilian clothes and a mind still wired for a war zone. After years of watching my back in the service, the simple act of trying to sit still felt like the hardest mission of my life. I needed a place where the noise stopped, a place where I could breathe without scanning every tree line for a threat. That was how I found the property on the outskirts of town through an online tax lien auction. The listing called it a fixer-upper, a neglected structure sitting on an overgrown acre that the county had seized after the previous owner vanished off the grid 15 years prior. To the rest of the world, it was just an eyesore, a burden of unpaid taxes forgotten by everyone except the local ledger. To me, it was a blank page. The house was a single-story structure built with sturdy timber and stone, showing every bit of its age. The roof sagged slightly on the western side, and the paint had peeled away from the siding like sunburned skin. But the municipal utilities were still connected. When I turned the kitchen faucet on my first afternoon, water sputtered through the pipes before running clear, and the overhead lights flickered to life with a low, familiar hum. It had electricity and running water, satisfying the basic comforts I needed without forcing me to rough it in the wilderness. Yet, as I walked the perimeter of my newly acquired land, my instincts started to buzz. A soldier learns to read the land, to spot where nature ends and human intervention begins. The wire fence outlining the property was not just worn down by weather. The strands had been systematically clipped and bent outward in several places, as if someone had deliberately forced a path through repeatedly over the years. Deep tire ruts, long since overgrown with tough weeds, cut through the brush toward the back of the property line, suggesting heavy vehicles had once frequented a spot that should have been entirely isolated. I dismissed it initially as teenage vandalism or trespassers looking for a quiet place to drink away from the town. But the house itself held secrets that no amount of scrubbing could wash away. While pacing the creaking hardwood floors of the main living area, testing which planks needed reinforcement, my boot heel caught on an uneven seam near the base of the stone hearth. The sound was subtly different. A hollow thud rather than the solid knock of timber resting directly on concrete joists. Kneeling down, I ran my calloused fingers along the edge of the wide oak board, noticing faint tool marks where the wood had been pried open and reset long ago. Using a heavy-duty flathead screwdriver from my tool belt, I worked the rusted nails loose, lifting the heavy plank with a sharp groan of old fasteners yielding to pressure. Beneath it lay a sealed metal lockbox resting inside a shallow, hand-dug compartment lined with moisture barrier plastic. My heart beat with a slow, measured rhythm as I pulled the box out into the pale afternoon light. A small brass padlock secured the lid, which yielded easily to a sharp strike from a heavy hammer. Inside were not family heirlooms or hidden cash, but stacks of documents, financial ledgers, and photographic negatives protected in plastic sleeves. I pulled out a handwritten journal and flipped to the first page, recognizing that name signed at the bottom. Arthur Miller, a local journalist who had disappeared without a trace back in 2008. His entries detailed a chilling investigation into the Vanguard Corporation, the massive chemical plant sitting 3 miles down the shoreline. The papers laid out explicit, undeniable proof that Vanguard had been systematically pumping heavy metals and toxic industrial byproducts directly into the deep aquifers feeding the Great Lakes Basin, bypassing every environmental regulation known to the state. The previous owner hadn't just abandoned his home. He had been sitting on a powder keg of corporate corruption, hiding the evidence right beneath the floorboards before he was forced out of the picture. Before I could fully digest the weight of the files, heavy footsteps echoed on the porch outside, followed by a sharp, authoritative knock on the wooden front door. I slid the documents back into the lockbox, pushed the floorboard roughly into place, and walked to the door. Standing on the porch was a middle-aged man in a crisp brown uniform with silver stars pinned to his collar. Sheriff Higgins. His eyes were small and sharp, sweeping past me to inspect the interior of the house with a territorial glare that made my skin crawl. "Declan Cross, right?" Higgins asked, his voice carrying the gravelly weight of a man accustomed to being the absolute law in a town where nobody questioned him. "Word travels fast in Galeport. People around here usually steer clear of this old place. It carries a lot of bad history." "It was cheap at the tax auction," I replied, keeping my voice neutral, offering nothing more than what was necessary. "I don't mind a little history." Higgins leaned against the doorframe, resting his hand casually near the holster of his service weapon. "Well, the county spent over a decade trying to clear the title on this lot after the previous owner skipped town. Strange that a veteran just rolls in and picks it up for pennies on the dollar without asking questions. You ought to be careful, son. This county has rules, and some old matters are better left buried where they belong." The veiled threat hung heavily in the freezing autumn air between us. Higgins wasn't just making small talk. He was checking to see if I had stumbled onto whatever the local authorities had helped sweep under the rug 15 years ago. I met his gaze steadily, letting the silence stretch until the sheriff cleared his throat, gave a tight nod, and turned back down the walkway toward his patrol cruiser. I watched him drive away, kicking up loose gravel, and immediately stepped outside to check the exterior utilities. Around the back, near the corner where the crawl space vent met the foundation, the insulated housing for the main heating water intake had been deliberately smashed inward. A sharp metal pipe had been driven directly into the line, rupturing it completely. The circulating water had leaked out and frozen into a solid sheet of jagged ice against the brickwork. It was not an accident caused by settling foundations or winter frost. It was a targeted, silent message from someone who wanted me cold, uncomfortable, and eager to pack my bags and leave. Standing there in the bitter wind blowing off the lake, a cold realization settled into my bones. The sabotage wasn't just a random act of malice. It was the opening salvo from people who knew exactly what was hidden inside this house. They thought a broken heating system would drive me out into the snow within 48 hours, letting them reclaim the property quietly. They didn't understand who they were dealing with. I had spent years surviving harsh terrain and hostile environments, where comfort was a luxury and endurance was the only currency that mattered. With the temperature dropping rapidly as the sun dipped below the tree line, I walked over to the stack of seasoned oak logs I had hauled in earlier that week, picked up an axe, and began splitting firewood. The sharp ring of steel hitting wood echoed through the quiet yard. I carried the logs inside, loaded the heavy iron firebox of the old wood stove in the corner of the living room, and struck a match. As orange flames began to dance and crackle behind the glass door, throwing steady waves of heat across the room, I looked down at the floorboards, hiding the metal box. I had come here looking for a quiet life to outrun my past. But looking at the firelight reflecting off the rustic walls, I knew the battle had already found me. The evil that poisoned this land was real. It was local. And for the first time since hanging up my uniform, I knew I had nowhere left to run. The morning sun offered no warmth, only a pale, watery light that barely pierced the heavy gray clouds hanging low over Lake Michigan. I was outside, using the back of my axe to drive a temporary patch over the ruptured waterline, when a sleek, black luxury SUV rolled up my gravel driveway. It looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of overgrown weeds and peeling paint. A man stepped out. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than my truck, paired with expensive leather overcoats that offered no real protection against the biting wind. He walked with the unhurried, arrogant stride of a man who was used to owning every room he entered. "Mr. Cross, I presume," he said, stopping a few paces away. His smile was perfectly practiced, reaching his mouth but leaving his eyes cold and calculating. "My name is Russell Pierce. I represent Vanguard Industries." I leaned the axe against the chopping block and wiped my hands on a rag, keeping my posture relaxed but my weight evenly distributed. "You are a long way from the corporate office, Mr. Pierce. What does Vanguard want with a foreclosed property in Galeport?" Pierce chuckled, adjusting his leather gloves. "Let us dispense with the formalities, Declan. We know who you are, and we know about the unfortunate administrative error that allowed this parcel to fall into your hands at the county auction. Vanguard has a vested interest in developing this shoreline. We are prepared to offer you a highly generous sum to vacate the premises by sundown. Consider it a windfall for a returning veteran." He reached into his breast pocket and produced a sealed envelope, extending it toward me. I did not move to take it. "I am not interested in selling," I stated simply, my voice carrying the quiet, unwavering authority I had honed over years of command. "And I am not interested in Vanguard." Pierce's smile evaporated. The polished corporate veneer slipped, revealing the ruthless enforcer beneath. He withdrew the envelope, slipping it back into his coat. "You strike me as a practical man, Mr. Cross. A soldier understands when he is outgunned. This town belongs to us. The sheriff works for us. If you refuse this offer, you will find that the winters in Michigan can be incredibly unforgiving, and accidents happen to isolated people all the time. I have survived worse places than Galeport," I replied, meeting his hostile stare without blinking. "Get off my land." Pierce stared at me for a long moment, his jaw tightening. Without another word, he turned, climbed back into the warm confines of his luxury vehicle, and ordered his driver to leave. The tires spat gravel as they sped away. The corporate threat was clear, and I knew they would not wait long to follow through. As night fell, the temperature plummeted, and a heavy darkness enveloped the house. I sat in a high-backed armchair in the corner of the living room, shrouded in shadows, watching the glowing embers of the wood stove. I did not sleep. Just past midnight, the stealthy crunch of boots on frozen grass reached my ears, followed by the sharp, localized shatter of glass from the kitchen window. The intruders were trying to be quiet, but to a man trained to detect ambushes in pitch-black environments, their movements were careless. Two silhouettes slipped through the window frame, their heavy footfalls scraping against the linoleum. I remained completely still, controlling my breathing, waiting until they crossed the threshold into the main hallway. As the first man raised a heavy flashlight, I moved. I closed the distance in 3 silent strides, striking the lead intruder in the solar plexus and sweeping his legs out from under him in one fluid motion. He collapsed heavily against the drywall, the breath knocked completely out of his lungs. The second man lunged at me with a steel crowbar. I stepped inside his guard, deflecting the downward swing with my forearm while delivering a punishing strike to his jaw. The metal tool clattered to the floorboards. I twisted his arm into a brutal joint lock, applying enough pressure to ensure he understood the absolute peril he was in. He cried out in agony as I shoved him forcefully toward the front door. "Tell Pierce this house is not a place he can trample," I growled, hauling the first man to his feet and shoving him out the door right behind his partner. "Next time, I will not be this polite." They scrambled away into the darkness, leaving a trail of blood drops on the frost-covered porch. It was a clear message, but I knew it would only buy me a narrow window of time. Vanguard would not send local thugs next time. They would send a professional cleanup crew. I had to move the evidence. I retrieved the metal lockbox from beneath the floorboards, packed it into a canvas duffel bag, and fired up my truck. I did not drive into Galeport. Instead, I took the back roads, navigating the treacherous, icy asphalt for an hour until I crossed the county line into a jurisdiction Vanguard did not control. I stopped at a brightly lit 24-hour convenience store and purchased a prepaid smartphone with cash. A few miles down the road, I found an all-night diner. The air inside smelled of stale coffee and fried food, and the only other patron was a weary truck driver asleep in a booth. I ordered a black coffee, slid into a corner booth, and connected the new phone to the diner's unsecured public Wi-Fi. Carefully, I removed the documents from the lockbox. Under the flickering fluorescent lights, I used the smartphone's camera to capture high-resolution images of every ledger page, every corporate memo, and every environmental report detailing the toxic dumping in the Great Lakes. I opened an encrypted email application and typed in an address I knew by heart. It belonged to Luke Brennan. Luke and I had shared the same mud, the same meager rations, and the same terrifying nights in combat zones. We had bled for each other. Now, he was an investigative journalist working out of a major newsroom in Chicago. There was no one on this earth I trusted more. I attached the files and sent the email. Then, I drafted a text message to his personal number. Luke, found a massive toxic cover-up in Michigan involving Vanguard. Files are in your inbox. I am dealing with hostile forces and heading back into a storm. If you do not receive a safety confirmation message from me by 6 a.m., hand everything over to the federal authorities. Do not wait. I pressed send, removed the battery and SIM card from the burner phone, and crushed the device under the heel of my boot in the diner's parking lot. The truth was out of Vanguard's reach now. I climbed back into my truck, feeling a grim sense of satisfaction. I could have driven south, disappearing into the interstate system to wait for the authorities to act. But I could not leave yet. Sitting on the nightstand back in that run-down house were my military dog tags and a weathered photograph of my old unit. Irreplaceable pieces of my soul. The only tangible proof of the men I had lost. I would not let Vanguard's thugs throw them into a fire. I pointed the truck back toward Galeport. As I drove, the weather turned violently. The infamous Michigan lake effect snowstorm, fueled by the freezing winds sweeping across the open water, descended with terrifying speed. Within 20 minutes, the light snowfall morphed into a blinding whiteout. The headlights of my truck illuminated nothing but a solid wall of driving snow. The wind howled, rocking the heavy vehicle as ice began to coat the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. I forced the truck down the final stretch of county road leading to my property. The world outside was a chaotic blur of white and gray. Just as the outline of my driveway came into view, a deafening crack echoed through the freezing air. A massive, ancient pine tree, buckling under the sudden weight of the accumulating ice, and the ferocious wind snapped at its base. It crashed violently across the narrow access road directly behind my truck, blocking the only path back to the highway. I slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the slick surface before coming to a halt. I grabbed my duffel bag and stepped out into the biting cold. The wind cut through my jacket like a knife, and the snow was already drifting past my ankles. I stared at the fallen timber, a massive barricade of wood and shattered branches. The road was impassable. I turned and looked toward the dark silhouette of the house, standing defiantly in the blizzard. I had returned from my past, and now I was trapped in the epicenter of the danger. The storm had sealed the arena, and the final battle for my peace was about to begin. I pushed through the waist-high snowdrifts, fighting the relentless, howling wind to reach the front porch of my property. The cold was absolute, a physical force that seeped through my heavy jacket and sought my bones. Once inside the house, I locked the sturdy wooden door and immediately went to the bedroom nightstand. My numb fingers closed around the cold metal of my military dog tags and the worn edges of the photograph showing my old unit. I slipped them securely into the inner breast pocket of my coat, keeping them close to my heart. Just as I turned back toward the main living area, a sharp, violent crack echoed from outside, followed immediately by the agonizing groan of straining metal and timber. The main power line leading to the house, burdened by the immense weight of the accumulating ice, snapped in the gale. The overhead lights died instantly, plunging the interior of the house into a suffocating, heavy darkness. I navigated the familiar layout by memory, making my way to the old wood stove in the corner of the living room. I struck a match, sheltering the fragile flame in my cupped hands until it caught the dry oak logs I had stacked earlier. The fire flared to life, casting long, erratic shadows across the peeling wallpaper. The violent storm had given Russell Pierce the perfect blind spot. The roads were blocked, the telephone lines were down, and the roaring wind would mask the noise of any conflict. If Vanguard wanted to erase me and stage a tragic house fire to cover their tracks, this was their golden opportunity. I had moved to Galeport to leave my past behind, to firmly bury the violence that had defined my adult life. But looking around the dimly lit room, illuminated only by the flickering firelight, I knew I had to awaken the soldier I used to be. My inner turmoil, the desperate desire for a peaceful civilian life, had to be locked away. I had to channel that frustration into the strength to survive. Moving with quiet, deliberate purpose, I prepared the house. I dragged heavy oak furniture across the main hallway, overturning the solid dining table to create a tactical choke point. I scattered broken glass near the entryways so that any intruder would announce their presence with a misstep. Then, I positioned myself in the deep shadows near the kitchen, where the firelight barely reached, and waited. The waiting was always the hardest part, a grueling test of discipline against the creeping cold and the exhaustion settling into my muscles. My breath plumed in the freezing air of the unheated rooms. Hours bled away into the darkness. The blizzard raged with terrifying intensity. Then, barely audible over the relentless roar of the wind, I heard the distinct, heavy grind of large vehicle engines straining against the snowbanks. followed by the heavy crunch of boots on the porch. They did not bother knocking. The front door splintered inward, the deadbolt giving way under the sheer force of a heavy breaching ram. The freezing wind rushed into the house, feeding the embers in the stove until they glowed a fierce, angry orange. 4 men stepped into the cramped entryway, their faces obscured by dark, cold-weather gear, holding heavy tactical batons and suppressed firearms. They moved with the coordinated precision of trained professionals. I let the first 2 men step past the choke point I had created, allowing them to step into the flickering light while I remained cloaked in darkness. Then I struck. I launched myself at the closest man, grabbing the barrel of his weapon and forcing it upward while driving my knee fiercely into his ribs. The impact forced the air from his lungs in a sharp gasp. I stripped the weapon from his grasp and used the stock to strike him across the temple, sending him crashing heavily into the overturned dining table. The second man pivoted, swinging a heavy iron pipe. I ducked beneath the vicious arc, the metal whistling inches above my head, and delivered a punishing series of strikes to his midsection, finishing with a sweep that sent him hard to the floorboards. The remaining 2 men retreated a step, raising their weapons. I dove behind the heavy kitchen counter just as a flurry of suppressed gunfire tore through the drywall, showering me with chalky dust and jagged wood splinters. My stamina was draining rapidly. Every movement felt heavier, the biting cold and the massive surge of adrenaline deeply taxing my muscles. Using the cramped layout and the darkness to my advantage, I crawled through the narrow pantry connecting the kitchen to the side hallway, flanking their position. I emerged directly behind them. 1 man turned, but I was already there. I disarmed him with a brutal wrist lock and shoved him forcefully into his partner. They tangled, losing their footing. I used the momentum to drive them both out the shattered front doorway, into the blinding snow, securing the entrance. Inside the cramped living room, the firelight illuminated a scene of absolute chaos. Broken furniture, shattered glass, and unconscious men littered the floor. My chest heaved, pulling in icy air. I was battered, bleeding from a shallow graze on my shoulder and running on sheer willpower. I systematically disarmed the men on the floor, tossing their weapons far into the deep snow outside the broken windows. The grandfather clock in the corner, miraculously untouched by the struggle, showed the time creeping steadily toward 6 in the morning. Outside, the blizzard showed no signs of stopping. But Vanguard was not done. Russell Pierce's voice drifted through the broken windows, barking furious orders over the wind. They realized they could not take me in close quarters. A moment later, the strong, acrid stench of gasoline began to seep into the house. Pierce's reinforcements were splashing accelerant across the wooden porch and the exterior walls. He intended to finish the job exactly as he had planned. A tragic, accidental fire caused by an old wood stove. I stood in the center of the living room, my muscles burning with severe exhaustion, gripping a heavy iron fire poker. The flames in the stove danced, mirroring the impending destruction outside. "Burn it down," Pierce commanded, his voice muffled but clear enough to convey his absolute malice. I braced myself, prepared to charge through the front door and take the fight to them in the snow. I glanced at the grandfather clock, the hands aligned perfectly at the top of the hour. 6 o'clock in the morning. Before Pierce's men could strike a match, a deep, mechanical roar vibrated through the frozen ground. It was not the wind. It was the synchronized thunder of heavy diesel engines. Through the shattered windows, the blinding whiteout was suddenly pierced by intense, sweeping beams of light, followed instantly by the chaotic, brilliant flashing of red and blue. A convoy of heavy armored SUVs and a massive snow-breaching vehicle, a tactical Bearcat equipped with a steel plow, smashed through the fallen pine tree and the towering snowdrifts as if they were made of paper. The cavalry had arrived. Luke Brennan had kept his word. Federal Bureau of Investigation special agents, clad in heavy winter tactical gear, poured out of the vehicles, weapons raised and flashlights cutting through the blizzard. State police cruisers formed a tight perimeter behind them, their sirens wailing loudly, a stark contrast to the terrifying isolation of the night. "Federal agents, drop your weapons. Get on the ground." The commands were broadcast over a powerful vehicle loudspeaker, echoing across the frozen lakefront. Pierce's men, caught completely off guard and blinded by the tactical lights, dropped their gasoline cans and raised their hands in immediate surrender. I walked to the shattered doorway and watched as Russell Pierce was slammed against the hood of an armored SUV. His expensive charcoal suit was covered in snow, his wrists bound securely in heavy zip ties. The arrogant sneer was completely gone from his face, replaced by the pale shock of a man who realized his reign of corruption was permanently over. I dropped the iron poker. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a bone-deep ache, but also a profound sense of relief. An FBI special agent approached the porch, lowering his weapon as he saw me standing there, battered but alive. "Declan Cross?" he asked, his breath visible in the freezing air. "Your friend in Chicago made a very compelling phone call." I nodded slowly, reaching into my jacket to ensure the photograph and my dog tags were still safe. They were. I stepped out onto the snowy porch, the freezing wind whipping across my face. The storm was finally beginning to break. To the east, over the turbulent, icy waters of Lake Michigan, a thin line of pale gold pierced the heavy gray clouds. The long, brutal night had ended, and a true dawn had finally come to Galeport.